All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Stephen Terizin, for dedicating all of Sherman Drashos this month in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert Zinbunim Tzvi Ben Chaim Zichron Lebracha, on the occasion of his 20th yard site. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Ayala and Sarah Steinberg, and the source of continued health for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha, and for an ultimate and enduring refuah shalema. Baruch and Bracha Rifkin, in memory of Yaakov ben Yisrael, Aaron, Doba bas Avram, Label ben Yaakov, and Kreindl bas Label Zichronim Levrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah, should have one together with Kol Chole Yisrael, and Halavai we should be Zoch and Meres Hashem to continue Besoros Tovos for Klal Yisrael. We'll say with that, let us begin. We have a great daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Zayin 67, and we are picking up in Meres Hashem on Samech Vav Amud Beis. Samech Vav Amud Beis. Okay. Great. So we're picking up the Mishnah Samech Vav 66b. So the Mishnah says as follows: V'kulon. Fulan. So actually we started this Mishnah yesterday, but let's just start it again if it's okay. The Kulan Mitam Bisalis. Supposed to say now the Mishnah is picking up with what we call, batched karbanas. Meaning what? It happens, right? These are the carbonic outtakes. So what happens over here? Something went wrong with the carbon. Now, by the way, as we've seen already, there's a variety of different things that could go wrong. What went wrong is not really as important in this moment as the fact that halacha l'maisa, and remember, we're talking about carbon ha'of. See, the chata sa'of, ola sa'of. So what exactly went wrong is not so important. What matters right now is you have a carbon ha'of that is not usable. It's not usable. So now what is the Mishnah telling me? Even though, again, it's not usable, so remember, again, halacha l'maisa, even though it's not usable, however, malika removes the status of nevela. As we spoke about at the end of yesterday's shir, halacha l'maisa, generally an animal dies without shchita, then it's called a nevela. A nevela conveys tuma b'mago b'masa, with either carrying or with touching, but when an animal has shchita, even if it's, let's say, unfit for consumption, it's no longer a nevela, therefore no longer conveys tuma. The same idea applies by bird offerings as well. Once a bird offering has had malika, even if it turns out that the carbon is not a valid carbon, malika is the equivalent to shchita and removes tuma. So therefore, again, this bird carcass will not go ahead and convey tumas nevela. Incredible. So the Gemara says, and furthermore, they are all subject to me'ilah. Now I will say now a word about this for just a moment. When is something subject to me'ilah? Generally, now what is me'ilah? Me'ilah means, again, let's just define our terms. So inappropriate use or mundane use of consecrated property. Let me further qualify that. Mundane personal use of consecrated property. When is something subject to me'ilah? When it's not given over to human use. If something is given over to human use, it's not subject to me'ilah. Let me give you a good example of this. So let's say, again, a carbon before zrika is subject to me'ilah. After zrika, for example, let's take a chatas ha'of. So remember again, chatas ha'of. How is a chatas ha'of done? Number one, a quick review. How many simanim? Chatas ha'of? One. Right? Again, it has both zrika and mitzui. Where's the blood applied? Lamata michota sikra. Right? Ultimately, again, below. What happens ultimately, again, to the body of the bird after you do your zrika and mitzui? What happens to it? It's eaten by the kohanim. Now, again, since the chatas ha'of is given over to kohanim, therefore, again, it's no longer subject to me'ilah, right? Which makes sense. Now, again, even though you and I, when I say you and I, okay, us non-kohanim, right? I can't eat that carbon. I can't eat that chatas ha'of. But since it's given over to consumption for someone, i.e. the kohanim, therefore it's no longer subject to me'ilah. So that, just remember that rule. Once something is usable by someone, it's not subject to me'ilah. usable by no one, it is subject to Me'ilah. So the first thing the Mishnah is introducing me to is that halacha l'maisa, if you have a carbon ha'of and the carbon didn't work for whatever the reason, you did malika, it's not working, not the malika is not working, the carbon is invalid. So number one, it is not metame. So in other words, the malika worked like shchita, it's not nevela. Number two, the Mishnah says it will still be subject to Me'ilah. We'll see subject to Me'ilah. Okay. Chutz mechatas of shasa lamata kimai sechatas l'shem chatas. With the exception of what's not subject to Me'ilah, a chatas ha'of that was done lamata, meaning the blood application was done appropriately below the chutas sikra, kimai sechatas, and procedurally it was done exactly like the chatas is supposed to be done, l'shem chatas, with the intention for chatas, which is another way of saying a proper chatas. A proper chatas ha'of is not subject to Me'ilah. Why is a proper chatas ha'of not subject to Me'ilah? Why not? Why not? Because since it's consumed by the Kohanim, it's given over for use by someone, therefore not subject to Me'ilah. Now again, Rabbi said, remember, it's not subject to Me'ilah once the Zrika is done. Right? Obviously, pre-Zrika will be subject to Me'ilah, but post-Zrika is subject to Me'ilah. Rabbi said, now this stands in contradistinction, for example, to chatas ha'of. I'm sorry, to olas ha'of. Because remember again, olas ha'of, who is it consumable by? Who is it consumable by? No one, right? It's fully on the Mizbeach. So because it's not given over to anyone, therefore subject to Me'ilah. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. Right. It just, if you take a quick look at Rashi, just to show you this, Rashi says this is in the bottom lines, the wide lines, about 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up at the bottom. Chutz mechatas ha'of she'asa lamata kimai sechatas l'shem chatas t'ksheirahi v'yesh l'shas heter l'kohanim v'shuv ein b'me'ilah afilu l'zar. So Rabbi said, do you hear how interesting this is? Since if a chatas ha'of is done appropriately, right, you go through the entire procedure, it is given over to the kohanim for consumption, therefore it's not subject to Me'ilah, even to a zar, right, which means if I go ahead and I come into the Beis HaMikdash and I go ahead and I take that bird and I use it for fuel in my fire, again, consumption will be something a little bit different, but I use it for fuel, I'm nene from it, that's not Me'ilah. It's not Me'ilah, it might be theft. Right? I don't know if I took it from the Kohanim, it might be theft. But Lamaisa, it's not Me'ilah. So once something has a heter, right? Sad heter, ultimately, again, not subject to Me'ilah. Fascinating. All right, let's go weiter. Olas of shasa lamata, kimai sechatas, l'shem chatas. Okay, so what I'll say, so now we get a little bit more complicated over here. Watch this case. Watch this case. Olas ha'of. So now again, olas ha'of. Let's go through this. Olas ha'of. How many simanim? How many simanim? 2. Right? Remember again, what do you do with it? Mitsui, right? You do mitsui, you squeeze out the blood. Where do you squeeze out the blood from? Head and body, right? Head and body both offered up separately. Where is the blood application? Lamala, above the chot hasikra, and ultimately again fully burned on the mizbeach. Okay, so now in this case, I messed up my olas ha'of. Right? How do I mess? By the way, Joe, you're my hero. Anyone who joins Daf Yomi during Zevachim, right? Either you're out of your mind or you're ridiculously holy, right? I'm gonna go with the second, ridiculously holy. Welcome. Okay. So make sure you're nice to him so he comes back. Hashem. Says the Gemara, Ola Sa'of, Shasa Lamata, Kimai Sechatas L'Shem Chatas. So watch this. So now, in this case, I messed up Ola Sa'of. What did I do wrong? So again, number one, Asa Lamata, which means what? Where did I do the blood application? Below the Chot HaSigra. Problem number one. Because remember again, where is Ola Sa'of done? Lamala. So issue number one is I messed up the blood application. Number two, Kimai Sechatas. I treated this like a chatas, which means what? One siman, right? One siman with leaving the head attached. So already, I'm totally messing this up. Wrong blood placement, wrong procedures, l'shem chatas. And ultimately, again, I had in mind that it should be for a chatas. So I totally botched this on every single level. So the shaila now is, what's the status of the carbon? Rabbi Lazar Omer, Mo'alimba. So Rabbi Lazar says it is subject to Me'ilah. It's subject to Me'ilah. Rabbi says, now why would it be subject to Me'ilah? Look at Rashi. So Rashi says again, Rabbi says about 6 lines up from the bottom. Taha olahi umiyot Me'ilah sashas hetel kanam inla. So Rabbi Lazar says, look, it's going to be subject to Me'ilah. Why is it subject to Me'ilah? Why? Because it's an olah. And the only thing that removes you from Me'ilah is what? A shas heter. Remember, both say this is important. In order to be extracted from the construct of me'ilah, what do you need? there has to be permissibility to someone. In this case, was this botched Ola ever permissible to someone? No. And since its designation is an Ola, as much as you mess this up on every single level, it is still subject to Me'ilah. Rabbi Shmuel says, no, ein Mo'elin ba, absolutely not. It's not, there's no Me'ilah. So we're going to see something absolutely, dramatically, ridiculously, overwhelmingly amazing, which is Rabbi Yoshua actually holds that this Ola is converted into a Chatas. I know, it's crazy. But it's actually going to be true. At least according to Rabbi Yoshua. He says that when you have a situation like this, even though designatively wise, I know it's not a word, right? But designatively wise, it was considered to be an Ola, since on every single level, right? The actual blood application, the actual procedure, and the actual kavana, you did it l'shem Chatas, it becomes a Chatas. Now, the good news about that is once it becomes a chatos is not subject to Me'ilah, right? Why? Why not? Because it's usable by the Kohanim. So I'll say, so fascinating machlokes over here, which we'll see. And if you look at Rashi says, 5 lines up on the bottom, Rabbi Shmuel Omer ein Mo'elin, Dechivan deshina shma u'maseh u'mekoma l'shem chatos na'asis chatos. It was wild. It's wild. Again, Rabbi Yeshua says that literally, again, even though the whole intention of this was to do an Ola, because you changed it essentially procedurally and kavanah-wise to a chatos, it becomes a chatos. Crazy. So I'll say, it's not this becomes a conversation. Rabbi Eliezer, excuse me. Rabbi Eliezer is the disputant to Rabbi Yoshua. So Rabbi Eliezer says back, Rabbi Eliezer, Uma im chatos she'ein mo'elin ba l'shma. So when it comes to a chatos, that when done lishma, when you do a chatos lishma, there is no me'ilah. Okay? Kishashina eshma mo'elin ba. When you go ahead and you had in mind for something different, ultimately, it is subject to Me'ilah. So if that's the case, Ola shemolim ba lishma, therefore an Ola, which is subject to Me'ilah when done for lishma, kishashina eshma inodin shemalabo. Certainly, if you go ahead and halacha l'maisa change its designation, it should be subject to Me'ilah. That's his kal v'chomer. So be sure it starts back on there. I just want to point out how interesting this is to see this type of dialogue in a Mishnah. Right? You don't usually see this dialogue in the Mishnah. This sounds like Gemara dialogue. Interesting. Amr Rabbi Yoshua, lo im amrit. Amr Rabbi Yoshua, lo im amrit bechata sheshina eshma l'shem ola. So Rabbi Yoshua retorts back and he says, no, not true. Think about this. If you have a chatos, which you changed the designation, right? You changed the kavana for an ola. You did it for an ola. Shekein shina eshma l'davar sheish bo me'ilah. You're changing the designation to something that is subject to me'ilah. Tomar ba'ola sheshina eshma l'shem chatos. In the case of an ola that was offered up l'shem chatos, shekein shina eshma l'davar she'ein bo me'ilah. You're changing the designation ultimately again to something that is not subject to me'ilah. Top of Samach Zayin 67a. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Fari Kachei Kadoshim. I'll bring you a case of Kachei Kadoshim. Now, what's unique about Kachei Kadoshim? I'm again, this is going back a little bit Chazara. Where are Kachei Kadoshim shachted? Where are they shachted? Soften. Right? So, as opposed to Kachim Kalim, where are Kachim Kalim shachted? Anywhere in the Bosai. By the way, how good does it feel to possess carbonic knowledge? Right? How good does that feel? To not be mystified, baffled, and pretend like you don't hear the question when someone asks you something about karbanos. But at least to be in possession of some, we're not getting smicha in it, but at least to be in possession of some basic carbonic knowledge. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't possess that knowledge, it's okay. It's not too late because we're going to be doing this for the foreseeable future, right? So even if you have not yet amassed your basic carbonic knowledge, just open your ears, open your heart, and again, it'll flow in. So again, Rabbi says like this, when it comes to Kachei Kadoshim, sheshachtan bedaram, v'shachtan l'shachim kalim yochichu. Watch this. What about a case of Kachei Kadoshim, which again, you made the mistake. What did you do? You shechted in the south. Now again, I will say, remember again, that's wrong because Kachei Kadoshim are shechted in the south, are shechted in the north. And what happens? You shechted l'shem Kachim Kalim. Now here's a case where you botched Kachei Kadoshim. You did two things wrong. Number one, kavana-wise, you did it wrong as you did it l'shem Kachim Kalim, right? The lower sanctity karbanos, like a shlomim, right? And number two, you also botched it because you did it in the south as opposed to Kachei Kadoshim that have to be done in the north. In this case, shekein shina eshmam l'davar she'ein bo me'ilah. change the designation to something that does not have Me'ilah, right? Because Kachim Kalim don't have Me'ilah. Umolin Bahan, and yet they will still be subject to Me'ilah. Af'ata al tetama ala ola. So too, again, Rabbi Elazar says, back to Yeshua, so don't wonder about the case of the Ola. Because even though you change the designation to something that's not subject to Me'ilah, Shima Luba, that it should still be subject to Me'ilah like its original designation. Rabbi Shmuel says, no, lo, im amrit bekadshe kadashim, sheshachtan bedaram, v'shachtan l'shem kachim kalim. No, because in the case of kadshe kadashim, where again I both say, number one, you botched the location, right? It should have been done in the north, you did it in the south. And furthermore, again, you botched the intent. It should have been done l'shem kadshe kadashim, but instead you did it l'shem kachim kalim. Shekin shina eshmam l'davar sheyesh bo iser v'heter. So this is very interesting. You change the designation ultimately again to something that has both iser and heter. Now, here's what's interesting. Kachim kalim. Remember again, let's take a shlamim for example. A shlamim has part of it that is consumed by the owners and kohanim, and part of it that's burnt on the mizbeach. The part that is burnt on the mizbeach is subject to Me'ilah, and the part that is consumed is not subject to Me'ilah. So interestingly enough, this is a different kind of case. Yesh ba eser v'heter. Tomar ba'ola sheshina shmala davar shekula heter. That's different than the case of the ola that was shechted l'shem chatos, because there you totally switched its designation, and it is not subject to Me'ilah at all. Okay, so bottom line, what comes out from the Mishnah are a number of important facts. Number one, even when you mess up a karban ha'of, if you did malika, ultimately again, that will remove any type of tumah, right? So malika takes away nevela status. Good. With the exception, good. That's halacha number one. Halacha number two, but it'll still be subject to me'ilah. The only time a karban ha'of is not subject to me'ilah is when? By chatos. Because again, when it comes to me'ilah is removed ultimately again when it is permitted for usage by someone. But if it's not permitted for usage by someone, then ultimately remains subject to me'ilah. The rest of the Mishnah then is designated to one simple case. You have an ola sa'of that you totally messed up. How did you mess it up? You did proper malika, but ultimately again, blood placement was wrong, right? But we put the blood below the red line, below the chota sikra. That's problem number one. Procedurally, you followed the procedure for chatos, and you even had kavana for chatos. What is the status of this karban? So Rabbi Elazar says, ultimately again, halacha l'maisa, it is subject to me'ilah. Because essentially he says it's treated like an ola. It's treated like an ola, even though again, halacha l'maisa, it won't satisfy your obligation of an ola. It is treated like an ola. Rabbi Yeshua says, what are you talking about? It's not treated like an ola. And again, I'm sure doesn't say this explicitly. Rashi says about seeing the Gemara, but essentially Rabbi Yeshua says, no, it's converted to a chatos. And once it's converted to a chatos, ultimately not subject to Mila. The rest of the Mishnah is then going back and forth regarding this machlokes. Good. Says Gemara, let's go. I was about to say, Samach Zayin Dav 67a, the Gemara. Tanya, Amar Lo, Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi says Rabbi Yeshua like this. Ashim sheshachta b'tzaf on the shem shlam yochiach. So both say they're still going at it. So what about the following case? What about an asham that was shechted in the north, ultimately again, for the sake of shlamim, will prove my point. Now both say, I remember again, in this case, asham, what category is asham? What category? Kachei kadashim. Right, kachei kadashim, right? Asham chatas, kachei kadashim. So where is it normally shechted? Right? Safan, north. Now again, so here in this case, you went ahead, you shechted it in the right location, but you shechted it for the wrong designation, right? Ultimately again, that halacha l'maisa. Now what I want to point out is asham, remember after zrika, is not subject to me'ilah, because asham, like chatos, is consumed by the kohanim. So halacha l'maisa over here, you shechted it in the right place, but for the wrong designation. Sheshina eshmo, ultimately you change the designation, umo'linbo, and it is subject to me'ilah, which is interesting. So what do you see from here? That a change of designation, ultimately again, can go ahead and make it subject to me'ilah. Therefore, don't wonder about the case of ola. Even though you change the designation, shema luba, that it should still be subject to me'ilah. They're just going back and forth with this. Rabbi Shmuel says, lo, im amit ba'asham, shem shina es shmo, lo shina es mikomo. No, but here's the difference with the asham case. it's true, you changed the designation, you had it in mind ultimately again for Shlamim, but Lamais, you did it, you offered it in the right place. Tomar Ba'ola, in the case of the Ola, this is referring to the case of the Mishnah, right? Rabbi say again, remember the case of the Mishnah was the most extreme case of change. You have an Ola Sa'of, and what did you do? You had in mind that it should be for a Chatas. Procedurally, you did it like a Chatas. You applied the blood like a Chatas. So you changed everything over here. Tomar Ba'ola sheshina eshma v'shines mikoma. In the case of the Mishnah, you changed the place and the designation ultimately again of the Ola. Amar Rabbi Eliezer said, Ashem sheshachtu b'daran l'shem shlam yochiach. So Rabbi Eliezer, I'll bring you another proof. What about a case of an Asham that was shechted in the south? L'shem shlamim. I both say here you botched everything, right? Because Asham is supposed to be done where? B'tzapon in the north. So here you shechted it in the wrong location for the wrong designation. So the Gemara says, Sheshina eshmo v'shines mikamo. You changed ultimately again literally the designation of the carbon, and you also changed the location. And yet, umoalinbo, it will be subject to me'ilah. Af ata al tetame al ha'ola, so too don't wonder about the case of the ola. Shiafa pisha shina eshma v'shines mikama. Even again, we'll say, remember, whenever we say ola, we're referring to the case in our Mishnah. That's the ola sa'of, where again everything was done l'shem chatas. So don't wonder about the case of the ola. Shiafa pisha shina eshma v'shines mikama. Even though you went ahead and you changed the designation, shma means right, you changed the designation and you changed the location, it will still be subject to me'ilah. Amar Yeshua, lo. No, because in the case of Asham, where you change the designation and you change the location of Veloshinas Masav, but procedurally, you still did to it what's supposed to be done to an Asham. Yet in the case of the Mishnah, Tomar Ba'ola Shashina Eshma, Ve'esma Aseha, Veshinas Mikoma. See, Rabbi say, what's very unique about the case in Mishnah is that Mamish, you changed everything about the carbon, right? The only thing that was Ola about this carbon, right? Ola's oath was what? Was the initial designation. But after that, everything else that you did was halacha l'maisa, some type of Ola, some type of chatos. Amarava, b'nei malay. Why doesn't he say Hashem sheshachtu b'daram l'shem shlam b'shinei bailim? So why not go? So why not set up the following case? Maybe the case of the Asham should be like this: an Asham that was shechted in the south. So the Rebbe say again. So remember them, wrong location. The Shem Shlamim, right? Wrong designation. B'shinui Bailim, and for wrong owners. Oh, that's good. I don't know, it's not good. It's bad, right? But in terms of like from a change perspective, you've changed everything. Sheshina Eshmo, V'shines Mikomo, V'shines Maisav. So in that case over here, you've changed everything. You've changed the designation, you've changed the location, and you even changed the procedure. So the Gemara says, Midalo Kamar Lehachi, Shmamina Nachis Rabbi Eliezer Letamid Rabbi Yeshua. So ultimately, again, from the fact that Rabbi Eliezer did not answer this, it turns out Rabbi said that what? That Rabbi Eliezer must have been convinced of the reasoning of Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi say, here we go. Here it is. Get ready for it. The Omer Rav Ada Bar Ava. Omer Haya Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua used to say the following. Rabbi say, now remember, we've said this outside, but we've never seen this explicitly, and the Gemara is just coming to this conclusion right now, and it sounds like even Rabbi Eliezer, who is the disputant of Rabbi Yoshua in the Mishnah, comes around to this logic. And what is this logic? Here it is. Ola sa'of sha'asa lemata k'maise chatos l'shem chatos. That if you have an ola sa'of, that ultimately again you did lemata, you did the blood application ultimately below the chudas, below the red line, k'maise chatos, and procedurally you're doing it just like a chatos, and l'shem chatos, you have kavana for a chatos. Get ready for it. Kivan shemalak basimin echad nimsheches v'nasis chatas ha'of. Wow! Once you shecht one simin, the carbon is fundamentally transformed into a chatas ha'of. I will say that is dramatically amazing, bordering on ridiculous, right? Because I will say nowhere else in the world of carbonos do we ever find that a carbon could actually be transformed into something else. But here, Rabbi Yeshua's logic is like this. In this case, I understand you designated it as a chatas, as an ola sof, I understand. But lemaisa, you've done nothing that indicates that this is an ola sof and faker, just the opposite. Everything you've done ultimately again has shown that what? That this is a chatas. And I will say again, I want to point out what's unique. Every single step in this carbonic process is screaming chatos. Therefore, Rabbi Shmuel says, essentially, let's halachically and categorically transform it into a chatos, which is incredible. Yeah, absolutely incredible. I will say that's Rabbi Shmuel's logic, and it sounds like Rabbi Lezer agrees with him. But there's also a tremendous Musar Haskell on this. What's the tremendous Musar Haskell? That in life, at the end of the day, what truly defines you is not what you think, but it's what you do. You can think whatever you want, but it's your actions that truly concretize, create, and solidify your identity. So you could have a machshava that I'm an olas ha'of. You could think that. But if you behave like a chatas, then that's what you are. Who you are and what you are is defined by what you do, not what you think. Not to say that what I will say now, I know what you're going to say, I know what you're thinking. You're like, oh my gosh, your mamish using daf yomi to contradict Reb Tzadok, right? Because Reb Tzadok just said to us the last 2 mornings that it's all about the cheshek. It's all about what you desire. Again, yes, desire is incredibly important. But at the end of the day, the metric of successful living is not what you think, but it's what you do. And I will say this is one of the greatest challenges in life. Because we all have beautiful ideas and hashkafas and goals and aspirations, and it's beautiful, it's fantastic. But lamaisa, having beautiful thoughts and beautiful goals and dreams and aspirations really is only meaningful if they find expression in dynamic activity. What you think in life will only get you so far, but it's what you do that truly solidifies and concretizes who and what you are. You could think all you want that you're an olas ha'of, but if your behaviors are chatos, then your behaviors define ultimately who you are. Incredible. The Gemara says, if that's the case, chatas ha'of nami, she'asa lamala kimaisa ola. So if that's the case, then the reverse should also be true. Right? What's the reverse case? The reverse case is like this. So chatas off. So again, I will say, so if I have a chatas, that I did lamala. So I did the blood applications above the chota sikra. Good or bad? Good or bad? Chatas off. Bad, right? Because remember, chatas is below ola. So in this case over here, I'm doing the blood applications like an ola. Kimaisa ola. And again, I'm treating it like an ola as well. So if that's the case, michi malik ba simin echad timashe v'tehavi ola self. I should say just the opposite. If I have a chatas, and the chatas, right, it designates a chatas, and yet I do the blood application above, and I do the procedure like an ola, as soon as I shech the simin, ultimately it should be transformed into an ola. Maybe you'll say, yeah, you're right, that should work. Here's the problem. This is how the Mishnah is set up. My love, kachi atza v'sulo. Now, both say, if you notice, by the way, the Mishnah only discusses one case. What was the case of the Mishnah? The case of the Mishnah was an olas ha'of that was done like a chatas. The Mishnah never discusses the other case. It never discusses a chatas ha'of that was done like an olah. So the Gemara says, my love, kachi atza v'sulo. Isn't it saying that this is the structure of the Mishnah and don't infer any other case? Lo, kachatza shal kula Mishnah. Rather, the Gemara says, no, perhaps this is the structure of the Mishnah in its entirety. In other words, perhaps the Mishnah was just giving one example of an olas ha'of that was done like a chatas, but maybe the same logic can apply ultimately again to a chatas ha'of that's done like an olah. Ravash says it's not true. I'll tell you why. Bishlama olas ha'of sha'asa lemata kimaisa chatas hashem chatas. The case of an olas ha'of that essentially was done fully like a chatas, and done fully means blood application, procedure, and intent. The reason why that becomes a chatas, kevan daha hechshira b'simin echad v'chshira b'shnei simanim. So we'll say, so ultimate va'olas ha'of lemata lesa. So we'll say, here's the issue. The issue is like this. The reason why that'll work, that case of olas ha'of done like a chatas, is because once the blood application is done below, you're out of the parsha of olah. There's no such thing as an olah that has a blood application below. Furthermore, again, interestingly enough, there is a commonality between olah self and chatas, which is both of them require shechting of simanim. Obviously, olah 2, chatas 1. But once you've done that first one and you've done the blood application below, you've removed yourself from the parsha of olah. Kevan de malak bas siman echad mimshechas v'nasis chatas ha'of. So both said this is incredibly important. Remember, this all goes back to one core theme by Karbanos, which is the zrika defines everything. So once you're talking about a case where you did zrika or mitzvah, below the chota sikra, there's nothing, you can't call yourself an Ola anymore, right? There are certain actions that a person does or that are done that fundamentally remove something categorically. So once the blood is applied below, that's it. You're not an Ola anymore. You can't be an Ola. Listen to this. Kevan Amar Malika b'chomakom kshira michi malak basimin ifsala. Rabbi say, interesting enough, by Chata Sauf, right? Mar said that what? That Malika is kosher ultimately again anywhere. Anywhere. So the Gemara says, so once that happens, if you take a look at Rashi just a moment, Rashi is right across. Kevan Amar Mar, Malika b'chomakom b'mizbeach kshera, mishum malikas mala in kan shinui lafke mimena shem chatas, ve'in kan shinui hashem, ve'chevan de chatas gamar avodasa b'simin echad, mikodem sheyigmar ma'isa ola, chalale shem chatas shinim lekakula b'shalosh shas. So we'll say, so by chatas, since Malika can be done anywhere, therefore mechi malak ba simin echad ifsala. So we'll say, so if that's the case, once you did one simin, ultimately again this is an invalidated chatas. Ki hadar malik beidach simin hechi memashcha b'havi olas ol. So we'll say, here's the difference. A chatas, interestingly enough, has more flexibility. So the issue just is once that first simin is cut, and it's cut in a way of a chatas psula that renders it unfit. How you can't then go ahead and say, well, shech the second simin, but now it transforms ultimately into an ola. In other words, by the chatas case, once already you've messed up the process is messed up already by the first simin. Ola doesn't become until when? A second simin. But once it's been messed up at stage 1, you can't then recategorize it at a chatas at stage 2. Finish up the rest of that Rashi. He says, once kevan the chatas gamar avadas b'simin echad mikodem shigmar ma'isa ola. So remember again, the chatas designation is solidified and concretized earlier because it becomes a chatas after the first simin is shechted. Once that happens, chal ala shem chatos shenim lekakula b'shalo l'shma. This is what say. See what's happening over here. This is fascinating. This is so interesting. A chatos becomes a chatos when, right? At the moment you shecht one simin. What's the problem with the chatos in our case over here? You're having in mind for what? You're having in mind for what? Ola. So the problem is, I just shechted a chatos l'shem ola. What's the designation of a chatos that's shechted l'shem ola? What's the halacha? What's the halacha? Pasul. Most remember again, chatas is the one carbon where if you shechted shalol l'shma, you can't redeem it. So the problem just is, I just did the first simin, I shechted shalol l'shma, it's pasul. So now what do you want to say? When I shecht the second simin, let it be categorized as an ola. It doesn't work that way. You can't do that. Once something has become pasul, you can't go ahead and pull it back and make it kosher. So you hear this fascinating distinction? In the case of the ola that was shechted l'shem chatas, ultimately, again, essentially from the beginning, I removed it from the parsha of Ola. How did I remove it from the parsha of Ola? Because nothing about it says Ola. Nothing about it says Ola. Everything about it says Chatas. Okay, so that can be recategorized. In the case of the Chatas, here's the problem. Remember again, a carbon becomes a chatas before it becomes an ola, so to speak, right? Because a chatas, it becomes the person. So once I have this carbon as a chatas, and I'm doing malika, but I'm doing malika l'shem ola. Once I cut that first simin, I'm done. I messed it up. I messed it up because I already did a chatas over the wrong kavana. Once that's been done, the carbon is invalidated. Now you want to say, okay, but keep going. You do the second simin l'shem ola, doesn't work. It doesn't work. Once the carbon has been invalidated, you can't bring it back ultimately again to the point of redemption. Fascinating. Says the Gemara, Gufa, Omer Hava, Rabbi Shmuel Silber. So now we're going to go back and analyze this a little bit. I have no idea why I thought this was a shorter daf. Okay, good, fine, all right. It says this follows, good. This was a 555, but okay, fine, that's fine. So Gufa, or maybe a 550, or Omer Hava, Omer Hay Rabbi Yeshua. So what's this? Now we're going back. Remember, all of this really centers on one core principle of Rabbi Yeshua, which is that what? That Allah Chalamaysa, you could take an Ola Sa'of that has been compromised on every single level and transform it into a chat. I'm sorry. You could take an Ola Sa'of that was compromised on every single level and ultimately transform it into a chat Sa'of. That's Rabbi Yeshua's core concept. Now we're going to analyze this a bit more. So Gupa, Omer Vadabarava, Omer Hari B'Shua, Olas Ofsha Salamata, Kimaise Chatos, the shame Chatos. If you have an Olas Of, this is the case of the Mishnah. You have an Olas Of ultimately again that was compromised on every single level. Meaning, number one, blood application below the red line. Number two, procedurally, it was done like a Chatos. Number three, it was done l'shem Chatos. Once you do malika on one simin, nimshaches v'nasis chatas. Ultimately, again, it becomes a chatas, transformed into a chatas. Amud Beis. So Tasha Shabbos said this is a really interesting case. So these cases are a little bit more involved. Listen to this. Chatas lezu va'ola lezu. All right, so we'll say, now watch this case. Take a look at Rashi. This is very interesting. So if second line Rashi, chatas lezu, Rachel. It's very interesting. Also, it's not so common that Rashi uses names, which is also fascinating. Rachel, by the way, if Rashi uses names, you know this is confusing. Right? So here we go. So listen to this. So Rachel, shahaiset tzricha chatas leidasa va'olasa kvar karva. So we'll say here's the case. Remember again, we haven't really gotten into this in terms of like when you bring bird offerings, but one of the cases where a person would potentially bring bird offerings is in the aftermath of childbirth. Childbirth, again, it doesn't have to be birds, but if a person is impoverished, they can bring birds. So what happens? So Rachel has to go ahead and bring now, after birth, you bring a chatos and an ola. So Rachel, Baruch Hashem, Mazel Tov, had a baby. She has to bring a chatos and an ola, but she already brought her ola. So she has to bring a chatos. So again, Rachel and Leah, Baruch Hashem, both gave birth. So what happened? Rachel brought her ola, but still needs to bring her chatos. Leah brought her chatos, but still has to bring her ola. So each of them are showing up to the Beis Hamikdash with a bird. V'lachu kan be'eruv, v'kavu prayed the achas lechatos Rachel, who prayed the achas laolas Leah, v'nasan l'koy. So what happens? So Rachel and Leah are good friends. Again, Rachel needs a chatos, she already brought her ola. Leah needs an ola, she already brought her chatos. Together, they bought a pair of birds. They brought the birds to the Kohen. They said, Kohen, Rachel needs a chatos, Leah needs an ola, get to it. And they give the Kohen this pair of birds. And what happens? So chatos lezu va'ola lezu. So now we'll say, now what happens? The Kohen gets a little bit confused. And what does he do? It's a lot of pressure. Va'asa shteihen lamala. So I'll say, so what happens now if you offered up both birds lamala? So essentially what that means is you offered up both birds as an ola. So what's the halacha? Mechza kasher, mechza pasel. So again, that means the ola's kasher. So whoever needed the ola, she's good to go. And whoever needed the chatos, she's pasel. She missed out. It's not good. She has to bring another chatos. Shtein lemata, right? Again, so if you offered up both birds below, what does that represent? Like a chatos. Then again, mechza kasher, mechza pasel. Then again, the one who needed the chatos, she's good to go. But the one who needs the ola, she needs to bring another carbon. Achas lamala v'achas lamata. Oh, watch this. What happens if he offers one of them above and one of them below? So we'll say, what's the halacha? Shteihen psulos. Wow, fascinating. Then both are pasul. Why are both pasul? Sha'ani omer chatas karva lamala va'ola karva lamata. Because since there was confusion in this case, we have to be concerned that maybe the Kohen offered up the wrong carbon in the wrong place. And therefore, maybe he offered up, ultimately, again, the Ola below and the Chatas above. So neither, ultimately, again, are going to be Yotze. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. So the Gemara says, so what happened over here? So I asked the Gemara, I don't understand. Nihi nami the Ola karva lamata timashek fatevi chatasal. Rabbi say, but based on what we said, again, why would you say shneihen psulin, right? Why would you say shneihen psulos? Worst case scenario over here, which both of them are offered below, I could understand why perhaps the one who needed the ola wouldn't be yotze, but both karbanos should be kosher. Why? I will say, what did we say about ultimately again an ola sa'of that is totally offered up like a chatos? What's the halacha? Like Rabbi Yeshua becomes like a chatos. So you could say the woman who needed the chatos, she's good to go. The woman who needed the ola, okay, she's not yotze, but halacha l'maisa, her carbon is still effective. Why would you say shteihen psulos? The Gemara says, no, I'll tell you why. Eimer Rabbi Yeshua bechad gavra betray gavri mi amar. Because it will say it's very possible that halacha l'maisa. When did Rabbi Yeshua say that you can repurpose a carbon? That's by one person. But when you have two people, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, that's not going to work. He only applies it again in the individual's carbon. That could be repurposing. But once you're dealing with two people, Rabbi Yeshua perhaps would not hold that way. Incredible. So Tashma. Chatas va'ola ustuma mefureshes. Okay, so we'll say, now watch this. Here's another case. Chatas, ola, stuma, mefureshes. This is actually going to be dealing with three sets of birds. So take a quick look at Rashi for just a moment. You see that Rashi? It's actually right across. Chatas va'olas tumah precious asakul mechsa. So skip down a little bit in Rashi. Halchi garsina lav m'seches kinin. Here we go. Shtei nashim shelakhu gimel kinin be'erev. Two women, Rachel and Leah. They brought together 3 pairs of birds that they're sharing. They're sharing in all these pairs of birds. Here we go. Zu tzricha ola v'kan shalem. Achas chatas v'achas ola. Dahainu shtei olos v'chatas. So we'll say, so one woman needs she needs a bird pair plus an ola, which means she needs 2 olos and 1 chatas. The why is irrelevant right now, but this is what she needs. V'zu tzricha shtei chatas v'ola. And the other woman needs 1 chatas and a pair. So in other words, one woman needs 2 olos and a chatas, and one woman needs ultimately again 2 chatos and an ola. Upershu echa min hakinim pray the ola lezu, pray the chatas lezu. Vecha min hakinim hinichu stuma. Lo pershu eza pray the chatas ve'eza pray the ola. Vagimol persha pray the zu ola or pray the zu chatas. Aval shemos bailam lonis parshu. Okay, so I watch this case. So essentially, these women collectively need 3 pairs of birds. Why? Each of them needs a pair, a chatas ola pair, and then each of them individually needs an ola, needs a chatas. So what do? Watch this. So one pair of birds, they said, okay, Rachel, the chatas is for you, the ola is for you. One pair of birds, they said, the chatas is for one, the ola is for the other, and they did not designate which is for which. And the third pair of birds, they didn't even designate which is the chatas, which is the ola. Okay, that's the case over here. Don't ask why, right? They show up to the Beis HaMikdash, and they say to the Kohen, here. You can imagine that if you're the Kohen, you're like one of the, like a TSA agent. Like, oh, my shift is over. I gotta go. Right? I gotta go. Right? So they show up to the Beis HaMikdash, and give again these collective pairs of birds. Ultimately, I can do it. All right, supposed to, we're going to stop over here with this case. This is a good case to pick up with tomorrow. It's a short daf tomorrow, so it'll be fine. Shkech, what a daf. Shkech, Abosai. All right, Chev on Zoom. Have a great day, everyone.